Clayton Thomas-Müller is an organizer, facilitator, public speaker, and author focused on fighting for environmental and economic justice. He's worked for more than 2 decades in support of grassroots movements and indigenous peoples to defend against the unrelenting onslaught of the fossil fuel industry, and maybe most strenuously against the death-dealing pipelines, refineries, and extractive projects associated with the Canadian tar sands. He's a campaigner for 350.org, has worked with the Indigenous Environmental Network, Mesa Water Coalition, Global Justice Ecology Project, and Bioneers. I had the opportunity to talk to him about his memoir, Life in the City of Dirty Water, which you might have heard about as part of this year's Canada Reads competition, or because it's an absolutely brilliant book. In caring, luminous prose, Clayton writes in the book about his growth into the climate activist and storyteller that he's become. A phrase that comes up a couple of times in that book is this idea of having a PhD in hustle. I asked Clayton about that way of phrasing it, and he talked about how the book is partly about showing how he's seized multiple opportunities to acquire new knowledge, but without thinking of that knowledge as a commodity. Instead, for him, it's about applying knowledge, not just forming theories. Applying knowledge means actually trying to do the work of building community. On this point, he talks about his work as a youth organizer, where he's always aspired to make any form of outreach inspiring by ensuring that it's culturally relevant. One of the spaces where he's had to hone these skills is in the prison system. We talk about how he writes in the book about getting sick of the strategic violence used in prisons to keep incarcerated people, and especially the disproportionate number of racialized people in prison, subservient through fear. Fed up with the calculated production of division and fomenting of violence in the system, Clayton decided to form bonds that would protect himself and other Indigenous kids from being abandoned to harm. The title of his text, Life in the City of Dirty Water, has thrown some people off, he says. People assumed from the title that the book is only about what he calls his day job as an environmental activist and water protector. So Thomas-Müller, as a member of Treaty 6 Matthias Colomb Cree Nation, also known as Puckatawagan, located in northern Manitoba, is really making a very specific reference to Winnipeg with that title. The Cree and Ojibwe name for Winnipeg translates as murky water or muddy water. I asked him about some of the resonances, though, with that title and how it can open up conversations, reflections about the murky nature of political and environmental communication in our moment of catastrophic climate change. He emphasizes that the goal of his memoir is really to encourage readers' own interpretations, to agitate and create, and to just make people think. Because, as he puts it, there is no one answer to colonial violence and climate collapse. He says ultimately that it will take a, quote, hybrid mix of Western science, traditional ecological knowledge, and straight up magic to pull ourselves out of the dire and desperate mire of capitalistic accumulation and fossil-fueled modernity. The greed we see naturalized today, he feels, is by no means natural. It's a sickness and the product of disconnection from nature. The alienation we feel is a thing that derives directly from this uprooting. It breeds, he says, hyper-individualism, hyper-consumerism, and so he looks to unite people, quote, on the jagged intersections of our movement goals and our social movement sectors, to break down barriers and build up systems of accountability and transparency as we build the largest social movement in the history of humankind. We start the conversation by talking about the book's involvement in the strange spectacle of the Canada Reads competition. He admits that while it's been a blessing to have the book gain a broader audience because of Canada Reads, it was nonetheless super weird to be included, especially since the book is just one piece of a bigger, three-dimensional transmedia storytelling universe. There is a lot to be said about just the power of pushing people to engage with these texts through a thing like Canada Reads, but Clayton notes that one of the missing pieces this year was that while there was a rich diversity of books and experiences represented, there weren't any texts that talk about, quote, the white person taking responsibility for white privilege and systemic racism. In the face of that absence, he asks the pointed question, where's the deeper conversation about the demographics of our population in this country? Where's the conversation about the distribution of power, privilege, resources, land in Canada? And when will we have that conversation? Thanks so much for setting aside some time to talk about this book that is about healing. It's a memoir of healing. And in a lot of ways, I wanted to kind of center on that concept, that struggle for health in a world that is so incredibly toxic in many ways. And all of the different ways that the book is trying to think about health. But the first thing I wanted to ask about is this first move of the book, in a sense, where, you're actually starting life in the city of dirty water with a note from your mother, who, stresses in that letter that stories have to be told from the lens of the person that experienced them. I thought that was an incredible way to frame the whole book, by having the voice of your mom conveying all of your strengths, saying that you're a gift, but also saying that authenticity in storytelling is really rooted to a person, to the voice of the person that's telling it. And, it's something you've talked about in a few different places, like why you wanted to make your mother's voice so fundamental to the book.
Yeah.
To kind of cherish her as she's clearly cherishing you in that opening letter. But I wondered if you could just talk about how you feel your mom's sense of the importance of authenticity frames the book with its, unwavering commitment to radical honesty.
Well, I felt it was really important, as a central theme to my memoir, to lift up this concept of asking for permission, this idea of building out a culture of consent in this crazy, super toxic, as you had mentioned, hyper toxic kind of masculine dominated world that we live in right now. And, I asked my mom for permission to tell my story because our lives are so greatly intertwined. She was just a child when she had me here in the city of Winnipeg, 16 years old, and got flown here, by the system. She was a teenager when she got pregnant, and social worker that she talked to told her to come to Winnipeg because a life on the reserve as a single mom in the 70s would have been very challenging for both of us. And so she came to Winnipeg with the promise of a greater life, greater opportunities for herself and for her unborn kid. And, our experiences, both good and bad and everything in between, have been very much shared. And so I really, really wanted to ask the person who had the greatest influence and impact in my life, my ma, for her consent to tell my story, because so much of it is wrapped up in hers. And, the end result, of course, was the beautiful introductory letter that readers can listen to at the beginning of Life in the City of Dirty Water, the words of my mother.
Yeah, and I like that you say listen to, right? Because, the story really, in some ways, begins as this kind of oration, right? That's the kind of genesis of it. I find that kind of incredible. And I guess, since you gestured to Winnipeg, a place I've never visited, to be honest, I wanted to ask about the book's title, in relation to this idea of, and also in relationship to the genesis of the book, right? So, I guess the Cree and Ojibwe name for Winnipeg translates as murky water or muddy water. You don't tell the reader this until toward the end of the book. And I didn't know it, but, while I was reading the book. So my interpretation of the title went right to water contamination, actually, this really dire problem that afflicts especially Indigenous communities, but not just Indigenous communities.
Yeah.
And I started thinking about after reading the translation, I started thinking about all of the ways that your book is actually using the concept of murkiness, of being made to feel dirty.
Mm.
Racism is, in fact, this force that you frequently say gets experienced as a dirtiness, a shamefulness
Mhm.
by those that are subjected to it.
Yeah.
I know the book was the result of a long process, that you actually wrote a version of it first that you didn't feel you could publish.
Mhm.
And that this version is the direct result of working on the short documentary that you made with Spencer Mann.
Mhm.
Did the title originate with the film, and was there an attempt to keep the title kind of deliberately open-ended? Did you mean for it to be first and foremost like a direct reference to Winnipeg, or was it more like literary in some ways?
It's really kind of funny, eh? Because before the book dropped and when we started building up the hype around, the memoir and its release last August, it was really funny to me, friends that just shared the link without reading any descriptors or anything, because most
Mm-hmm.
people gravitated towards, my day job, which is, I work for the global climate organization 350.org, but I have a long history working in the environmental justice movement. And us, like many of us indigenous peoples, carry the title as a water protector. And um but yeah, it was pretty funny seeing a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people share, oh, our colleague Clayton Thomas-Müller is publishing a book on water protection, or fighting to protect the sacredness of water.
Yeah.
And really, it was, just a very specific reference to the term Winnipeg, which means, murky water or muddy water. Because here in Winnipeg, of course, this is where the mighty Red River and the Assiniboine River meet at the historical heart of our city, the Forks. And, of course, both rivers have muddy bottoms, and you can't really,
Mm-hmm.
they're not clear. You can't see into them.
Right. And yet, yeah, I like that as an author, like it is this very specific thing that then has all of these different sort of reverberations.
Mm,
I guess I'm like interested in the impact that you see the book making, like here in Canada, and what it meant to have your book included in the Canada Reads competition. Like you've mentioned in a few places that you prayed to participate in this kind of
yeah.
annual event. But I'm guessing that it was like a little bit strange on some level to be included in something called Canada Reads. Like taking part, it expanded the audience, I have to think, for the book. But, and maybe I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe you feel like Canada Reads can be something subversive, that like it can undo maybe some of the myths of kind of Canadian national identity that still persist in settler culture.
Mhm.
Um, like there's this Yellowknives Dene scholar, Glenn Coulthard, who once said in an interview that for him, the issue of settler-indigenous relations in Canada is a treaty question, but not a conventional treaty question where indigenous nations and these big, I'm quoting him, these big hegemonic institutions of the state relate to one another. He says it's more
Mhm.
about relationships between peoples and communities
Right.
and how we can draw insights from each other's practices and traditions. Do you think like the space of Canada Reads can contribute to that sort of coming together in a relationship? And was it weird at all to be included?
It was like super weird for sure.
Right.
But as I had mentioned in other conversations I've had about the memoir with media, um, when I started this process of Life in the City of Dirty Water, this storytelling project, because the book is one thing, but what my team and I developed was a massive three-dimensional transmedia storytelling universe that has about
Mm-hmm.
40 vignettes of unique stories that range from 1 to 5 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
stories that aren't in the book or the short documentary which lives on CBC Gem. um, we're developing out podcasts with people, who I shared my life's journey with thus far, who reflect on memories that I write about in the book. And, even if they're counter and, intuitive to the memories I have of the same moment. So there's lots of ways moving forward that Life in the City of Dirty Water will continue to like exist and kind of persist and be this kind of, beautiful storytelling, kind of piece representing the city that I grew up in. Um, but the book itself though poses this 60,000-foot question: what is it going to take for us all to heal from the violence of colonialism? and specifically, I think more pointedly, what is it going to take for Indigenous men to heal, from the violence
Mm-hmm.
of colonization and to move forward in a good way, and all the roles that were stripped away from Indigenous men through the process of colonialism. And, and I think that for me, it was a shocker when I got the call. Like, it was really funny, actually. My publicist from Penguin sent me a note before Christmas, I guess, and was like, "Hey, yeah, you got this. CBC reached out. They want to do a fluff piece on life in the city of Dirty Water. Should be just a short 10-minute interview." And I was like, "Oh, okay, that sounds great. No problem." And
Mm-hmm.
so I log into the Zoom link, and right away I'm like, "What the hell?" And my publicist is on the call. My editor from Penguin is on the call, Nicholas, and like four other people. And I was like, well, this is a lot of people for a fluff piece. What's up, folks?
Yeah, yeah.
And, the representative of CBC Canada Reads, like the Ogie Mao over there, the boss, kind of said, well, this is our favorite part of our jobs, and kind of jumped me essentially and said, we want to let you know that your book has been selected as one of the short list of the Canada Reads competition, and kind of everything, the gravity of the moment there just kind of pulled me deeper into my chair. And they said, we can't tell you who your champion is at this point. They were very secretive about the process. They said, but we want to let you know, and we want to book your time a few months out from now so we can do some media and
Hmm.
get ready for the competition, and then we'll introduce you to your champion. And it was like a whole process, right? Kind of very,
Yeah.
very like Hollywood, very like exciting. And
That's pretty cool, I guess. But
yeah,
weird.
and I got super emotional, and
Yeah,
I
yeah.
definitely teared up, and I told them flat out. I said, I prayed about this when I started writing this book. I said, I like 7 years prior,
Hmm.
I prayed them, because I've been a Canada Reads fan, like a lot of people that live here in these lands. They call Canada for some time now. I mean, the competition's been around for over 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
and I have
Yeah.
friends that have been in the competition and as authors, and so yeah, it was a big deal. And Dr. Suzanne Simard,
Oh, what a champion.
yeah, she's awesome. I mean, like I knew her already. She had
Mm-hmm.
spoke at the Bioneers conference, which I've been on the board of Bioneers for about 20 years now. It's the biggest environmental conference in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
California, every year. And so she spoke about her work, um, identifying elders of the forest, and identifying how grandmother trees in the forest actually take care of up and coming grandchildren in under the
Mm-hmm.
canopy, and how they communicate through a network, a sophisticated network, much like the mycelium networks that Dr. Paul
Yeah.
Statements talks about. They have their own internet, in ways that they can share nutrients, and all kinds of incredible things that, quite frankly, Indigenous peoples have known and maybe taken for granted for millennia.
Right.
But to have a non-native, PhD level, best-selling author, noted ecologist, kind of take a look at my very rugged memoir, and some of the native knowledge that I share in it, and to lift this up as something that the whole country should read. It was very humbling, and I was
Mm-hmm.
very, very, thankful. Big shout out to Dr. Suzanne Simard if she hears this podcast. Really appreciated her picking Life in the City of Dirty Water. But the dynamic was difficult. I was the first book knocked out of the competition, and I wasn't surprised, because
Hmm.
it's very difficult, and I see the same thing within the whole online book review culture and
Mm-hmm.
community. It's a lot of people have a hard time, giving a star grading to a personal memoir versus a fictional book. You know, and so I think that it was awkward maybe for the debates, for folks not to, like to
Hmm.
it's not a fiction, it's my life story, it is
Right.
what it is. So I think that, and I even heard a lot of people, express that, yeah, trying to compare a
Hmm.
memoir to a fictional book is challenging, especially when the whole country's watching you online and on TV.
It's interesting to think about like why they wouldn't be seen though as compatible. Like to actually kind of like dig into it a little bit because like it's still written, it's still creative, it's still full of ideas, but there's something about the authenticity of it versus like the sort of artificiality, as it were, of like an overtly literary novel that
Yeah.
is harder to defend. And yet I think Samard took like a really smart approach to saying like this is not just one person's story, this is actually um an articulation of like a path forward. It's about like
Yeah.
trying to imagine a way out of our current crises, and I was convinced certainly like that for that reason it is this like invaluable text. I've spoken to one other person, Francesca Equiasi,
Mm,
who competed in Canada Reads. She wrote Butter Honey Pig Bread, this like gorgeous novelistic kind of, but still based in her own story, kind of
yeah.
account of coming from Nigeria and finding community in food and drugs and politics and conversation.
Mm,
And her experience was similar, where the champion that she had this deep sense that that mattered kind of more than winning, that she had already won in some ways by having this particular champion who also cared about food in the same way. So I hear some of the same stuff.
Well, two
um
things,
yeah.
just on this topic,
Hmm.
of Canada Reads. You know, I didn't pray to win the competition. That'd be like
Hmm.
praying to win bingo. It's kind of not cool.
Hmm.
Um, but I did pray that it would be a part of that competition, so that the words that I shared, the stories and experiences that I shared, that it could reach the broadest audience possible. And
Right.
by broadest, I mean outside of the Indigenous community, right?
Hmm.
um, I really wanted this to be something that could be, in every school library, and, be a part of curriculum, from K to 12 all the way, into post secondary, which
Hmm.
it is already. And I feel very thankful about that. My challenge with the entire Canada Reads like composition of like all of the final shortlists this year was, you had a book about the migration of someone representing the Islamic community and that
Hmm.
experience. You had a book representing the diversity of an inner city Toronto elementary school. With brown and black and Indigenous kids, all a part of the beautiful story of Scarborough. And
Hmm.
and there was just this rich, diverse grouping. You got Michelle Good, and her Five Little Indians, which ended up winning the competition, which I was very, very pleased about, because it's such an excellent book. And Michelle is just a wonderful Cree leader and
Hmm.
storyteller. And of course, Washington Black,
Hmm.
which is this powerful story coming out of the Black community. And my big criticism of the whole thing was where is the book in that grouping, that's the book about the white person taking responsibility for
Hmm.
white privilege and systemic racism. um you know what I mean? It
Hmm.
felt a little bit what's that word, virtue signalish to me,
Right.
on a mass scale.
Right. It's like, look at the multiculturalism on display here. CBC kind of patting itself on the back a little bit.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. But like, where's the book about how the 80% of Canadian citizens who are happen to be white presenting? There's 11%, I think, black. 5 to 7% are represented by brown and black, brown, migrant people, Southeast Asian, and on
Hmm.
and on. And then you got about 5% First Nations, Inuit, and Métis across the country. And that's why, whether it's the topic of truth and reconciliation, or ending police violence against Blacks and Native people and other brown people, and on, these problems continue to persist, because
Hmm.
until racism becomes and colonization becomes a problem in the white community in this country, we're going to see a lot of the same patterns kind of continue on forward, regardless of how,
Mm-hmm.
if we're running our economy on oil or wind turbines, if we don't change systemic racism, we're going to have the same land use problems,
Mm-hmm.
colonization in a neo-colonial form occur, and on and on. And so that was my big thing about Canada Reads, is I sat and watched the champions defend all five of these incredible books and
Mm-hmm.
authors. I was like, where's the deeper conversation about the demographics of our population? Where's the conversation about the fact that, Indigenous women represent over 50% of the population now in the federal prison system? Like, and
Yeah.
meanwhile we represent less than 5% of the population. Is that because we're inherently evil? I don't think so. It's because of systemic racism and
Mm-hmm.
legacy issues related to not dealing with colonialism and all of its facets, including Indian residential school, and
Right.
especially in this time, while Canada Reads happened, we were discovering these unmarked graves, now which number over 10,000, and so yeah,
Yeah.
that part I was like, I wish we could have gone a little deeper, but
Mm-hmm.
I think that all five champions did a really good job.
I mean yeah, that's an incredible point in a lot of ways. Just like where's the conversation about the kind of white complicity in settler violence? It's just
Yeah.
it's not there. So that it kind of feels a little bit like tokenism without that piece. And that's there's so much in the book that I want to ask you about. But
Mhm.
you're talking about prisons in particular, and there is a lot in the book about the prison system.
Yeah.
I spoke recently with the authors, the editor, and two authors from a new book called "Disarm, Defund, Dismantle on Police Abolition in Canada," and this is the thing that book gives us, is this really, to use a prison metaphor, like panoptic view of how prisons operate in Canada. And one of the
Mhm.
things they say is that there has been historically this, as they put it, like carceral continuum, where it does begin, you have residential schools, you have the use of the RCMP to impose kind of strategic violence, and that like persists in the present. And your book is also trying to like talk about how, there is this kind of carceral continuum. You say that in prison, on page 55 of the book, you say you struggled to keep your humanity because people treated each other so horribly, and explain that like you learn how rigged the system is against Native people. But what you also say is that prison politicized you, that
Mhm.
while working in prisons was really difficult, because of just the kind of energy and the violence that was
Mhm.
ubiquitous there, it is also something that kind of radicalized you and prepared you for the climate struggle.
Yeah.
I see that as so incredible. I mean, like, it's something that you really end the book in some ways with, this idea that when things seem irredeemable, there's an underlying decency that we can count on.
Mhm.
How did you find hope in prison? How do you now kind of link those two things, the kind of
Yeah.
struggle against mass incarceration, racist mass incarceration, and maybe the struggle for like climate reparations and divestment from fossil fuels?
Yeah. Well, I think that, it's twofold. Um, I think directly through my own experience as a juvenile, having getting in trouble with the law, and ending up incarcerated in a juvenile detention facility in British Columbia during the 90s. This was a very profoundly like life altering experience for myself. Going to juvie, turning 17 in juvie, and when I was in juvie, I didn't get one visit from anybody for 4 months because my mom left British Columbia. My parents divorced, and she moved back to Winnipeg.
Hmm.
And my stepdad, Harry Mueller, he's German. He was working as a logger on the Haida Gwaii at the time, so he couldn't come and visit me. And so it was a very profoundly lonely experience going through the system at that time. I was only 16, and um, But it was also very formative because, very early on when I got into juvie, I discovered a copy of Malcolm X's autobiography, which my mother had actually gifted me in my youth.
Mm-hmm.
Growing up, there were three civil rights leaders that my mother consistently quoted and found pathways to bring into my life. And that, of course, was Dr. Martin Luther King, of course, Malcolm X, and, you know, Chief Dan George of Tsleil-Waututh Nation. These are three individuals that were always, characters that my mother would bring into my life, the words that they had shared. And so finding that book at the early stage in juvie, I must have read that thing like 80 times. And I took it with me everywhere I went because I got transferred to a few different facilities across the province in that experience. Um, and in juvie, one of the things I observed was how horribly different they treated indigenous kids locked up comparatively to non-indigenous kids, to white kids,
Mm-hmm.
and how these like really screwed up like prison guards that worked in juvie used like white bullies to kind of keep the rest of the population subservient through fear and through violence.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw a bunch of native kids get beat up like and put in the hospital while I was in juvie, and I just I couldn't understand it. um, and for me, I didn't understand why people were getting so mad. And so by the time I got to the end of my sentence, I got sick of all of it. And I started organizing with other native kids in the unit that I was in. And, we made an agreement that we were going to stick together and that we were going to create a culture of peace in the unit. And so we devised a plan, and we went against the bullies of the unit, and at the end of the day, for about a month, my last month that I was there was no fighting or anything,
Mm-hmm.
because we told the bullies, look, if you're going to go against one of us, then all of us are going to get you. And
Mm-hmm.
but we don't want to get you. So from here moving forward, we're going to share things. There was one fancy chair in the TV room that the biggest bully of the unit would get every night during TV time, and we made a plan that everybody would get a turn on the chair, and that it would be rotating. And
Right.
that was how the guards would create conflict and tension and fights, was through little things like that. They would strategically create that. Like, why would there only be one chair with cushions and then plastic chairs for everybody else
Mm.
in it? You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it stands out in the book. I remember that very distinctly. Like, and what's interesting too in that section of the book is that you're not actually like you don't ever sort of tell the reader that. You don't necessarily, like what you just said, you don't provide that interpretation, but what you do say is that the solidarity that you created
Hmm.
produced peace and an end to agitation, but that upset the officers, that was aggravating.
Oh yeah,
That to me is so telling, right?
yeah.
And what you're saying here is that there was actually like there was a strategy of creating division,
Hmm.
and creating conflict as a means of keeping people kind of pacified in some sense through fear and violence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it was just really crazy to me, how it was set up in there. And of course, later on in life, when I became a community organizer here in Winnipeg doing gang intervention work, I did a lot of work with members of the Native youth movement, going and doing workshops in Stony Mountain Prison, and Headingley Prison here in Manitoba, in the Manitoba Youth Center. This is back in the 90s during the gang epidemic here in Winnipeg, which not has not got better up till this point. But I got to work with a lot of lifers and work with a lot of programs here in the inner city that were all about, helping lifers and felons, with community reintegration that was culturally, cushioned
Mm-hmm.
and culturally relevant to them as they integrated back into the community. And a big part of that was a big part of why I went into that work was because my first job when I got out of juvie was working for my older brothers, who started the largest native gang in the country, the Manitoba Warriors,
Mm-hmm.
which originally was supposed to be like the American Indian movement, a community reintegration program so that felons could get jobs as security officers working at powwows or at indigenous community events. But then it grew into what it became, which was a organized crime entity,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately. And you know, um, I did that for a couple of years, but eventually, when my older brother John, he sat me down one day and he said, Clay, the heat's coming down, and I can tell, and I'm going to move back up north to Puck, and I'm going to go hunt moose. I'm going to get married. I'm going to have a bunch of kids, and I'm going to fish just like our dad. And I'm never coming back to the city. And
Mm.
he said, and I don't think you should, waste your life doing this either. I think you're smart, and I think you should get an education, and I think you should do something to help our people. And I said, shit, man. We got in a fight actually, and I was like, "Who are you to tell me what to do?"
Right.
And he said, "I've always respected you as a man, my boy, but this is the one time you're gonna respect my will as your big brother." And
Mm-hmm.
it was really interesting, because the next day, the mother of my sons, Corinne, we were dating at that time. I was, just only I think 18, and she says to me, I really like you, and I really want to keep dating with you and be with you, but I didn't sign up for this gangster shit.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to get, you're a smart guy. You need to go to school or something. And so, I did. I talked to my uncle Brian, who was the president of the gang at the time, and I told him flat out. I said, I want your permission to leave my work. At the time I was running a drug house for the Manitoba Warriors, and and I said, I want to go to school, man. I want to do something for my people. And he said, oh, okay. Well, yeah, I'll let you do that. But, he grabbed me by my wrist, really, really with a firm grip. And he said, but I'll tell you something, okay? And I said, what's that? And he said, if I find out you're hustling on the side while you're going to school, I'm going to fucking kill you. And
Wow.
it was really haunting, eh?
Yeah. You've got a couple moments like that in the book, right? Like a description of like really forceful confrontations, like the confrontation at Sundance with the cut man stands out,
Oh,
this
yeah.
now you know better
Yeah.
intervention where you get poked in the chest hard and it's supposed to make this kind of impact, right?
Hmm.
Um, so I mean, like there's this like push and pull. There's this like dance in the book around masculinity, where like as you say, like during the period running the drug house, like you were high on the power that came with it and the
Oh, for sure.
position and all that stuff. But you narrowly avoided, like this is sort of how part one of the book ends. You narrowly avoided this like mid '90s anti-gang legislation and how the government really cracked down in particular on indigenous gangs,
Well,
and like tried
yeah.
to make an example, right?
Yeah,
Um,
shortly after,
yeah.
literally weeks after I got myself out of that circumstance, and I moved in with my son's mother. We got our first apartment here in Winnipeg, and I signed up for an inner city program for at-risk, Indigenous teens, where
Mm-hmm.
you could get your GED. They'd introduce you to ceremonies. It was called Anishinaabe Oweji. Um, and I graduated from that program as valedictorian. And then I went into another program called the Medicine Fire Lodge, which is this radical program
Mm-hmm.
run by some hardcore OG activists in the city, headed by the late Larry Morissette, um, who is very well known here in Winnipeg, and one of my mentors and heroes growing up, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
um, and they designed, it was a community development program where at the end of the training you would, you get a certification in community development, from an indigenous world and cosmo view.
Mm-hmm.
But you also get like a cash bursary. It was like $2,500, which at the time was big money, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you did your own community development project. And so when I got out of that, my project was, I started an inner city youth organization called Aboriginal Youth with Initiative. And our focus, was working with young people here in the city to try and get them out of the gangs and to provide, decolonization support services. So instead of pathways or pipelines to prisons,
Mm-hmm.
we were trying to build pathways to Sundance and to other ceremonies, for
Mm-hmm.
young people. Because most of us who had been part of the Native youth movement, this social movement political apparatus in the 90s, um, that was all of our experiences. Once we got exposed to language and ceremony and culture and a connection back to the sacredness of Mother Earth, all of a sudden we had the headspace and the heart space to be able to start working not just on ourselves, but working to support other people who are trying to decolonize and get into a healthy life path.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a pretty wild time. Uh, you know, uh, then that led to quite a lot of incredible things.
No, yeah, and they're narrated in the book in so many different like compelling ways. You were talking there about education, and that got me thinking about like this phrase that comes up a couple times in the book. This
Mhm.
notion of having a PhD in hustle. I
Yeah.
love this so much. You talk about the way that you acquire knowledge so many
Hmm.
times in the memoir, like through mentorship, by gaining access to like course outlines and teaching yourself through them.
Yep.
You say that, because of the rampant racism inherent in it, you never had faith in the Western education system. And so it's like the book becomes this really powerful pitch for embracing a kind of informal education as an act of resistance.
Hmm.
And so you're speaking from like a not a credentialed place, but from like a street cred place, as it
Hmm.
were. And I guess like I want to ask you, like, how has that education and hustle, that kind of outsider self education, all your experience putting together, you know, theories and practices and organizations, indigenous led social movements, how has that enabled you to sort of see the patterns in society? Because this is one thing that you say, like, true knowledge really represents. It's not about like credentials, it's about really being able to see the patterns. How is that related to this idea of like having a PhD in hustle?
Well, I think it's a difference between college and university, right?
Mm,
It's applied knowledge versus theory.
right.
And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if you've got a PhD in a particular topic if you don't have relationships in community. um, you're going to spend a lot of time building those relationships, I think, to do the work that your PhD is specific towards.
Hmm.
um, Whereas, when we move at this pace of community and we build things from the grassroots up, and we go together, there's clarity and accountability,
Hmm.
to what we're building, and shared, I think, vision around goals and theories of change. um, that said, like, I love my academics, I love my friends in academia, they're awesome. Well, maybe not the anthropologists, but you know
You
um,
can do without those. Yeah. I know
but
what you mean. Yeah. There's some
but
radical anthropologists, but as a discipline. Yeah.
but I think that the point of that concept of PhD and hustle is that what I noticed was that a lot of the skills that I acquired surviving and participating in gang culture, and just living in the streets, being homeless, a lot of the different experiences and identities that I had throughout my life, I realized that those skills were highly transferable into professional kind of fields. And
Mm,
so, managing relationships is something that I really learned how to do well, being a drug dealer and kind of like, being a hustler, robbing and stealing and surviving, as a young indigenous person growing up in the inner city, with no one. Um, those skills really translated into working across social movements, and working across different social movement organizations and pulling people together on the jagged intersections of our movement goals and our social movement sectors, and trying to break down barriers and, build up systems of accountability and transparency as we build the largest social movement in the history of humankind. Back in the 90s, when I was doing like gang intervention work and decolonization work, I didn't know that that was going to lead to where I am today, but it set the groundwork,
Mm-hmm.
for that. And the kind of radical, I think, honesty that I've always brought to the table, because of my background, being so informal, for myself anyway, and it's gendered, like I don't think
Mm.
Indigenous women probably have the same experience I do, or those from the LGBTQ community either. I think it's different for everyone, but there's certainly shared experience in our collectiveness as Indigenous peoples, and how we relate to colonialism and how we undo it towards a pathway of reparations, truth, and reconciliation.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, like, so much of it is about like unlearning as well. Like early in the book, you talk about, I'll quote the book, like every Native kid deals with being told that their people have disappeared, that they no
Mhm.
longer exist. They're just a page in a social studies history book.
Erasure.
Like unlearning that. And as you say, like keeping the ember of tradition burning secretly as as a source of, healing, recovery. That's articulated really powerfully in the book too. I mean, like
Yeah.
you're like, what's interesting too is like this is something that, as you say, you're kind of trying to explain to a broad audience too, like as
Yeah.
this means of kind of creating, um, you know, a different capacity for relating to one another. And I wanted to kind of like, talk about the mode of address and who you're addressing and how that shifts in the book. Like, there are times where you're clearly addressing like a settler audience, asking us to
Hmm.
do these thought exercises of, imagining Christmas being banned and how that would
Hmm.
hurt, and like prompt you to reinvest in the meaning of that tradition if and when you were allowed to, legally allowed to. And like,
Yeah.
like earlier in the book and throughout, your intended audience is maybe more obviously Indigenous folks, where you're
Hmm.
like speaking in terms of what you're collectively fighting for. Given that you're really, hoping for this broad audience, I wonder if the book is actively trying to work toward like a less polarized world. I mean, some of the wisdom in the book is this knowledge that's been passed on to you. And you were
Hmm.
talking about like consent. Do you ever hesitate to share that knowledge? And, or is it about just like hoping it reaches as many people as possible and transforms kind of politics in this country and globally?
Well, we can transform politics and, our body of, of politics, economics, the way we socialize,
Mm-hmm.
our connection to Mother Earth, our connection to the cosmos.
Mm-hmm.
We can do that. But that doesn't mean that Indigenous peoples, and more specifically, like my own Cree people, are going to share some of our, things in our worldview and our cosmovision that are just for us.
Mm-hmm.
There's shit that white people and other brown and black people and other Indigenous peoples will never know
Mm-hmm.
about our Cree ways, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing wrong with that. Um, but what the book is definitely doing by asking the 60,000-foot question, what is it going to take for us to heal from colonialism? Is I hope that it's spawning conversations at dinner tables and at workplaces,
Yeah.
in parks, between people, in online forums. You mentioned the word subversity,
Mm-hmm.
and I tend to be that way. I'm a campaigner, working to end the era of big oil, and a lot of the work I have to do is very subversive.
Yeah.
A lot of the communities I go into don't want to hear about how bad George Bush was. They just know that if a refinery gets built in their community, it's going to make the kids sick, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't care how it's tied to the Persian Gulf conflict or the geopolitics of China or Russia or any of that. They just know, so you have to be very subversive to like trigger something inside of a human being so that they self actualize why they want to put their body on the line to protect their community from this encroachment of an outside entity trying to profit off of
Mm-hmm.
polluting their environment. And with the book, Life in the City of Dirty Water, I think there's a lot in there which was meant to just trigger people towards conversation. And part of the whole three-dimensional storytelling universe of life in this city of dirty water includes a stage performance that I do, a 45-minute powerful multimedia stage performance, including live performance of, R&B and traditional drumming. I read from the book. I show video clips. I even blacken out the theater and play some audio from a hunting trip that my brothers and I were on in Thunderchild Cree Nation, where you can hear the crackling fire and the goose honking and flying overhead.
Wow.
And and
I'd
I
love to
guide.
see that.
Yeah, and I did it. I did one show in California at the Bioneers conference, and I did one show here in Winnipeg at the West End, at the iconic West End Cultural Center. And
Hmm.
I was supposed to do like this big North American tour, and the show is followed by a 1 hour in depth dialogue between the audience and I on this question: what is it going to take for us to heal? You
Hmm.
know, what is it going to take for us to move through it? The only way through this is through it.
Right.
And we can keep delaying and delaying and delaying, but Native people ain't going nowhere. It's our land. you
Mm.
know we're the big brothers and sisters here, and everybody else, whether they like it or not, are the little brothers and sisters, and they got to listen to us. you
Mm.
know so
Come to Halifax, please. Come to. We need it here. We need that. We need that like reckoning in a city of a very, very dirty grid
Mhm.
that has I think an underestimatedly toxic car culture,
Mm.
as attached as we are in some ways to the beauty of nature. I think it can be a kind of superficial attachment that kind of thrives in some ways on that, like on these distancing gestures, right? Like,
Mhm.
it's anyway.
Well,
Um,
the long arm of Irving, from
yeah,
New Brunswick even into Nova Scotia is pretty terrifying. And
yeah, yeah.
funny story. I was speaking at Dalhousie one time in Halifax, and I asked people. I said, "Where's a place I can go down to the ocean, look at the water?" And they said,
Mm,
"Oh, Pleasant Point, Pleasant Point." And I
yeah,
went,
yeah.
"Oh, okay, okay." So I drove out there, and I saw that the trees were all broken from some kind of mega storm that had hit, a big climate storm. Was the way I was looking at it. And then I walked by. There was really nice manicured paved like walkway, and there's these big ships in the harbor there coming in and
Mm-hmm.
out. And I went down to the shoreline, and I had been in British Columbia literally 24 hours prior, and I had offered tobacco and prayed, and I washed my face with the water of the Pacific, and I offered my tobacco into the water, and I prayed for the Pacific Ocean. And then the next day, there I am in Halifax. I had flown to do another speaking event, and
Mm-hmm.
I went down to the water at Halifax at Pleasant Point, and I walked by these two young guys. They were skateboarders
Mm-hmm.
sitting there on a bench, and I think they might have been smoking a little ganja, and they're looking at me like, what's this guy doing?
Mm-hmm.
And then I started climbing down towards the water there, by where all the boats come in, and I went and prayed, to Gitche Manitou and to the ancestors, for the people and the water, and offered my tobacco, and then I took that water and I washed it on my face. And then all of a sudden I couldn't see, and my face started burning, and I started screaming. I was like,
Oh,
ah,
oh my God.
help, I can't see. And I could hear those two guys laughing at me like, ha ha,
Wow.
sucker. And then I hear them skateboard off, and I had to crawl up this rocky shoreline up to back to the water. And finally my vision started coming back, but my entire face was chemically burned. And
Wow.
then what somebody had told me was that that's where the big sewage outlet, where Halifax just dumps all their, like literally right where I washed my face.
Oh
I'm
my
trying to have
God.
this big indigenous sacred prayerful moment, connect with the
Oh,
Atlantic Ocean there in the Halifax at Pleasant Point Park,
oh
and
my gosh.
ended up almost blinding myself with the sewage of the city of Halifax.
You got a blast of the city of truly dirty water, where we
Yeah.
externalize, right? This is what capitalism does. Is just like it's an externalizing machine, and it just
Yeah.
yeah, just it just kind of belches this back out. And yeah, I feel like there is just like a really nasty separation
Yeah.
between the infrastructure, these kind of invasive infrastructures, and a different sort of like cosmology entirely. Anne Spice talks about, indigenous infrastructure being about the sort of like the great kind of web of life, right? And I feel like there just isn't really a conception of that here. And that is like, as funny and terrible as a story that is, it is also in some ways like it's telling the story of like having to confront just like the everydayness of the toxicity that these skateboarders would just like, of course you don't put your face in that water, as beautiful as it looks, it's just for looking at. You know what I mean? Like there's such a gap there.
Yeah.
And I guess like I wanted to kind of speak to that gap in a different way. Like you just had a conversation recently, a really interesting short conversation with Tom Hartman,
Oh yeah.
where, Hartman expressed a lot of curiosity about your book's account of the winter spirit, which
Oh yeah.
is, not something I know deeply, but is, I mean, it's, I sort of sense that Hartman was trying to translate this sort of story of the winter spirit into something that a westernized white settler could sort of wrap his head around. And
Hmm.
I'm not throwing shade at Hartman. Like,
Yeah.
I'm also a symptom of that same culture that can't always see indigenous cosmology as irreconcilably different. As you say, there are
Mhm.
Cree stories that are just can't be translated necessarily. But what Hartman couldn't seem to get away from is this assumption that what the winter spirit means is that greedy people aren't really responsible for their greed, that like greed is a symptom or a sickness that has almost like a supernatural origin. And I wanted to link this to a statement that you make in the last part of the book. This
Hmm.
idea that, quote, nothing proves the way everything is connected like a pipeline. So you're
Hmm.
like making this appeal to unity in the book, specifically when it comes to this existential threat of continued fossil fuel extraction. And if I'm
Yeah.
reading you fairly, it feels like you're encouraging readers to kind of, on some level, move past polarization and realize there is, as you say in the book, not just good guys and bad guys in the climate fight, but like
Yeah.
it seems to be a thing that like the eco-socialist left in particular is really invested in right now. The idea that developed nations like the US are historically at fault for their unquenchable desire for energy, that the climate emergency has really been produced by the greed of Irving, by the greed of climate criminals like ExxonMobil or Chevron or Syncrude or Suncor. Like it is the case that the people who are going to be hardest hit by climate impacts will be the most precarious, the people living with the fallout of colonization.
Yeah.
Um, but like, why did you want to at the same time convey the point that we need to maybe move beyond the vilification of climate criminals and understand ourselves as complicit in a system that perpetuates harm? Is the winter spirit just this kind of excuse for human greed? Or do you think we need to kind of like identify the actual, criminal sources of, profiteering off of just like the, pollution of the planet?
Yeah. Well, I think that there is no one answer.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I wrote about the winter spirit, and I reference it, and I think about it in my life path. And what I tried to share with Tom is that we grew up. I grew up with this story, about my great grandfather who fought a Wheatigoo, and
Mm,
after he fought that Wheatigoo, he became very, very sick, and his hair actually turned white, and he couldn't hunt or fish all summer,
mm-hmm,
and had big repercussions on our family. There's a lot more to that story that I don't share,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
but the point of it is that we're warned in the wintertime not to go out and when the snow is flying sideways, because that's when the winter spirit can get you. And on a deeper level in ceremony, we're told that only the strongest can go and fast. As Cree people, we have a spiritual practice of fasting in the spring, summer, fall, and winter. For 4 days and 4 nights without food or water, as a way to seek out guidance in our life, to get blessings, to become stronger. But it's said that it's very dangerous to fast in the winter time, because that's the winter spirit can get you. And, you know, I think that Witigu, much like a lot of things, you know, in our cosmology, you know, these interdimensional spiritual beings, you know, they're metaphors, in terms of how to take heed and to be humble and, you know, to walk your life as lightly as possible where you live. And we have seven sacred teachings that guide us through that process. And so I think that like a lot of people are going to take their own interpretation of that. And that's my goal,
Right.
is that it agitates and it creates like it makes people think about it. But you know, on a very hyper meta level, you know, the winter spirit metaphor to me represents, you know, imbalance on a global scale and what it can turn into, which is predatory economics
Mm.
and the destruction of our planet's ability to sustain us in less than 150 years. I mean, we're literally, as human beings, changing the chemistry of Mother Earth, you know,
Mm.
our one home in the universe. And so, you know, I think for me, you know, Witigu is a metaphor for capitalism and a metaphor for the sickness of greed that exists. But greed is not Witigu. You know,
Mm.
Witigu exploits the sickness of greed and, you know, is one of those things that can fill the emptiness that lives inside of us because of a disconnection to nature. You know,
Right.
that's one of the greatest impacts of climate of capitalism and colonialism is a disconnection to nature, and
Yeah.
and a hyper individualism, hyper consumerism, and all kinds, like a few different systems that end up separating us from this identity as the collective, and rather that makes us a hyperalized individual. And I think that technology also adds to that.
Mm.
And um, but meanwhile, human beings are reporting being the most lonely that we've ever been in the history of human beings, even with all this connectivity.
Mm-hmm.
So, the Witigu is a metaphor, that imbalance left unchecked can lead to, potentially a global scenario that ends our ability as human beings to live on the planet. And the teachings and in traditional ecological knowledge that indigenous peoples have been trying to share with, our brothers and sisters across these lands they call Canada, can help address some of that. I don't think it's the only solution that can
Mm-hmm.
address climate change and some of the other imbalances we face, like toxic masculinity, patriarchy. Um, I think that it's going to take a hybrid mix of Western science, traditional ecological knowledge, and straight up, magic to do
Hmm.
that. But, as I mentioned, the only way through it is through it. And, we don't have to recreate the wheel. We have all of the teachings from past social movements to, do what we have to do, which is to build the largest social movement in the history of humankind, to mobilize human beings and governments to, to intervene at a mass scale, and to, transition away from fossil fuels. We absolutely need to do that. And we
Mm-hmm.
need to take a look at these systems, whether it's our fossil fuel centered truck and transport system, our fossil fuel intensive agricultural complex. I think the biggest one of all, the military industrial complex, but also urban planning.
Yeah.
Um, we need to
Absolutely.
take a look at all of these systems, and and that's where I had an issue with Hartman's analysis of the Witigu, of what I was trying to articulate or create a metaphor for. People, are not responsible in the way that they think they are for climate change. Okay. I think it's good for people to be environmentalists, to be conservationists, to walk as lightly on the earth as they can, to, promote that within their family and their community and their place of work and their place of worship.
Mm-hmm.
However, there's about 70 or so companies that are almost 99% responsible for the world's for existential threat of climate change. And then the other player in that, of course, is the U.S. military. and the entire military industrial complex. They're the biggest polluters on the planet. So, if we get away from if we focus our social movement our people powered movements on changing these vital systems, to move away from fossil fuel, to that strategy to be rooted in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that we be taking notions, especially in Canada, in our Canadian economy, that we take into consideration this idea of reparations, towards truth and reconciliation. Because Indigenous peoples, the only reason that we have a lot of problems in this country, to quote the late Chief Arthur Manuel from Secwepemc Nation, he said it best. He said, you gotta stop crying on the shoulder of the guy who stole your land. Indigenous peoples control less than 1% of Canada's landmass, and that's why we're cash poor. That's why we don't have money. It's because we have no land base. And at the end of the day, when we hear that word land back on our social media platforms, it literally means that, land back. And that's what Native people, I think, across the country, I don't want to speak for everybody at all, but when it comes right down to it, land back, is all about us, having the ability to build out our economies in a way that suits us, that matches our worldview and our cosmovision, and that isn't, and that our affairs are not meddled with by, colonizers. We have some way to go to get there, but I have great faith in the youth movements of today. They are so sophisticated, and their analysis is so much more intersectional, and the fear that they carry seems to be so much less than previous generation, even my generation. I think we carried a lot more fear than these young people do today. And
like fear of shaking things up, in a sense.
Fear,
just fear,
right across the board.
Right.
But I think that young people today are armed with information, and I when I was a teenager, we didn't even have cell phones. It was like a rich person thing, I remember getting my first Hotmail. It was 1995. I was
Yeah, I still have my Hotmail address.
I lost mine. I'm so sad about it, but anyway.
But no, yeah, things have radically changed. Let me just say, I can't believe, how wonderful this book is, and I'm so excited to see the ways in which it's like spawning these other beautiful things that are going to be in the world for people to think through. And I love what you just said about sort of, how, these things are metaphors, but they're also real, that they're, it's both things. They're both, material and symbolic. They're language, but they're also, material demands. So there's just so much that's hopeful in what you were just saying. And I appreciate you making the time today.
Yeah, no, it's a real pleasure to be here. And, I really want to appreciate the listeners. And, if people want to learn more about the work that I do, please follow 350 Canada on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook. Join our Facebook group. And if you want to learn more and stay in touch on future events related to life in the city of dirty water, a memoir of healing, just follow me on Twitter or on IG. I'm on all the social media platforms, my own individual account. Or you can sign up for my mail list at lifeinthecityofdirtywater.com.